the summer of 2018, the Watts family looked like the image of a modern, happy life. Chris Watts lived in Colorado with his wife Shanann and their 2 young daughters. Their home was neat, quiet, and ordinary. From the outside, nothing about the family suggested trouble. But behind closed doors, things were falling apart. Shanann was active on social media. She shared daily moments of family life, smiling photos, and motivational messages. Chris appeared calm and reserved in those videos, often standing quietly beside her. Friends described him as soft-spoken and reliable. No one considered him threatening. In fact, most people trusted him. That image would soon collapse. On the morning of August 13, 2018, Shanann returned home from a business trip just after 2 a.m. A friend dropped her off and watched her walk inside. That was the last time anyone outside the house saw her. Hours later, Shanann failed to respond to messages. She missed a scheduled appointment. This was unusual. Concerned, her friend went to the house to check on her. The door was locked. Chris Watts arrived shortly after and let her inside. Everything looked normal at first. Shanann's phone was there. Her purse was there. The children's belongings were untouched. But Shanann and the girls were gone. Police were called for a welfare check. Chris spoke to officers calmly. He said he had no idea where his family was. He suggested Shanann might have taken the children to a friend's house. His tone was steady. His answers were polite, but something felt off. Security footage from a neighbor showed Chris's truck parked in an unusual position early that morning. Investigators noticed this detail immediately. According to Chris, he had left for work alone. But the video showed him making multiple trips between the house and the truck. As the hours passed, the case drew attention. News cameras gathered outside the Watts home. Chris gave interviews, asking for his family's return. He appeared emotional but controlled. Many viewers noticed his behavior felt rehearsed. Behind the scenes, investigators began building a timeline. Chris had gone to work at an oil site that morning. Alone. This detail mattered. It placed him at a remote location shortly after his family vanished. At the same time, police learned something else. Chris had been involved in a secret relationship with another woman. This relationship had been ongoing for weeks. Messages showed plans for a future without his family. This discovery changed the direction of the investigation. What had first looked like a disappearance now looked intentional. Investigators focused on Chris. And within days, the story would unravel completely. As investigators looked closer at the timeline, small inconsistencies began to surface. On their own, each detail seemed minor. Together, they painted a very different picture from the one Chris Watts was presenting. Phone records showed that Shanann had not used her phone after returning home that night. There were no outgoing messages, no calls, no activity at all. For someone who was constantly connected and responsive, this silence was impossible to ignore. At the same time, Chris's phone showed movement and activity very early in the morning, long before most people in the neighborhood were awake. Then there was the truck. Chris told police he loaded work equipment into his truck before leaving for his job site. But the neighbor's security footage suggested something more. The truck was backed into the driveway in an unusual way, closer to the garage than normal. Investigators noted how many times Chris walked back and forth, how long the loading took, and how careful his movements appeared. This was not a rushed departure. While the search for Shanann and the children continued, Chris remained in the public eye. He spoke to reporters, asking for their safe return. His words sounded right, but his body language didn't. He smiled at odd moments. He avoided certain questions. To many viewers, something felt rehearsed, almost detached. Behind the scenes, police made a critical discovery. Chris had been in frequent contact with another woman. Their messages were not casual. They discussed future plans, trips, and a life without his family. The tone was light, hopeful, and completely disconnected from the situation he claimed to be in. When investigators confronted Chris with this information, his story began to shift. He admitted there were problems in the marriage. He said arguments had become more frequent. He described the night returned as tense, emotional, and difficult. According to him, Shanann had left the house with the children after a heated conversation. But there was a problem. No cameras showed Shanann leaving. No neighbors saw her. Her car was still in the garage. Her phone, medication, and personal items were left behind. Nothing supported the idea that she had walked out on her own. Investigators decided to change their approach. They brought Chris in for a formal interview. This time, they didn't accuse him directly. Instead, they let him talk. They listened as he repeated his version of events, filling the room with details that didn't quite line up. Then they introduced a key psychological step. Chris was told that Shanann might have harmed the children and that this could explain his behavior. The suggestion was carefully placed. The goal was to see how he would react. And he reacted immediately. Chris broke down and offered a new version of the story, one that placed responsibility entirely on Shanann. He claimed that in the chaos of that morning, everything spiraled out of control and that he had reacted in shock. But this version didn't hold up either. Investigators now had 3 different stories from the same person, each one changing as new information appeared. The timeline wasn't just cracking, it was collapsing. At this point, the case was no longer about finding a missing family. It was about uncovering what really happened inside that house in the early hours of August 13th. And the final version of the story was about to come out. When Chris Watts was brought in for the final interview, there was no version of the story left to defend. Every previous statement had collapsed. Camera footage, phone data, and the timeline all pointed to one conclusion. Everything that happened that morning followed a deliberate and ordered plan. This time, Chris explained everything step by step. In the early hours of August 13th, after Shanann returned home, the two had a long, intense conversation. During this discussion, Chris clearly stated that he no longer wanted to continue the marriage. They talked about separation, finances, and the future. The conversation lasted for hours and became increasingly strained. After this discussion, Chris admitted that he intentionally rendered his wife incapacitated inside the house. This act was completed at home, and for Shanann, everything ended there. Chris then went to the children's room. He stated that the girls were still alive at that point and unaware of what had happened. In the early morning hours, he placed them into his truck. The neighbor's security camera footage showing repeated movements between the house and the vehicle confirmed that he left the house with the children, not alone. Chris then drove to a remote and isolated worksite he visited regularly. This location had been deliberately chosen. It was empty in the early morning hours, familiar to him, and unlikely to attract attention. When he arrived, no one else was present. After reaching the site, Chris admitted that he intentionally rendered both children incapacitated there. These events occurred within a short period of time and entirely at that location. He then stated that he left all 3 of them at secluded points within the same area, where no one else was present. This account matched exactly with what investigators later found at the scene. The timing, the location, and the sequence of events aligned perfectly. There was no coincidence, no panic, no other person involved. Everything had been planned. Following this confession, there were no unanswered questions left in the case. Chris Watts was taken into custody, and the legal process moved quickly. No alternative scenarios were considered, because full responsibility rested with him alone. The outcome was final. Chris Watts admitted that he had deliberately ended his wife's life at home and his children's lives at the work site, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of release. This case became unforgettable not because it was complex, but because it was disturbingly clear. Everything happened in sequence. Every step was accounted for. Every gap was filled. And the most unsettling truth was this. From the outside, there had been no warning signs. The danger did not shout. It did not hide. It existed quietly within what looked like a completely ordinary life. The Chris Watts case continues to be remembered for this reason. Because sometimes, understanding the truth does not require complicated theories. It only requires looking closely at the timeline. If you want to hear more dark and mysterious true crime stories, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.